Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. Hello, Read Smart listeners. Welcome back to the official podcast for the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction, which, as you know, aims to promote the very best in non-fiction writing. I'm Razia Iqbal, your host, and I have just returned from a visiting professorship at Princeton. My thanks to Shahida Bari, who has sat in for me while I've been away. Now, today we're talking about the political biography, whether it's Churchill or Chamberlain, Blair or Boris Johnson. Readers have long been fascinated by the inner lives of those who walk the corridors of power. I'm delighted to welcome Sonia Purnell, who has written biographies of Boris Johnson and Clementine Churchill, alongside John Rentoul, chief political commentator for the Independent newspaper and author of a number of books on Tony Blair and New Labour. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hello.
Let's start by getting both of you to just outline for us what you think makes a great political biography. Sonia, let's start with you.
Well, I think it's answering a mystery, really. I mean, why do people go into politics? A lot of people ask that question because it doesn't look that much fun. It's not particularly well paid. The hours are awful, and everyone is rude about you. But I think, when you look at why people do it, there are quite often some really obvious reasons, but only if you look right back into their life, back to their childhood, into their marriages, the way that they sort of behave in private life. And that gives you a really interesting insight into why they behaved the way that they did, if it's an historical biography, or why they continue to behave the way that they do if it's contemporary one. And why is that important? Well, with contemporary ones particularly, is this the sort of person that you want to run your country? What might they do if they do run your country? And with historical ones, you can look at, well, why did they make those decisions? Why did they always get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, 7 days a week, and work extraordinary hours? And I think it really helps us understand ourselves and our country. I mean, ideally, I'd like to think that it might help us sort of vote better in the future, but maybe that is a bit idealistic. But I think the political biography is still a real it's an important thing, even though actually in recent years we've started considering politics as sort of a branch of entertainment. But that in itself is worthy of a political biography, and something that I try to cover in Just Boris. So there are lots and lots of things I think that we can find useful from a political biography, even for those people who aren't particularly interested in politics.
John Rentoul, do you agree that it's that kind of trying to pull the veil back from the mystery, if you like, that Sonia refers to? Because you're both journalists, and I just wonder the need as well to reveal something that we didn't know before, how much that plays a part in a political biography.
Yeah, it's about trying to understand the person. And obviously, as a political journalist, I'm reporting on politicians all the time. But the bits of political biographies that I always find interesting are the early lives, the childhood and the family life, the family story. And Sonia and I have both dealt with politicians who've had very interesting upbringings. I mean, Boris Johnson's childhood was extraordinary. His mother had a breakdown. His parents were divorced. But Tony Blair's was, not quite as traumatic, but his father had a stroke when Tony Blair was 11. And it's a very common pattern in politicians that you get intense ambition instilled into a young person when their father or their mother has a crisis at that kind of formative age. And it happened to Boris Johnson, and it happened to Tony Blair as well.
I feel like we're getting way ahead of ourselves in getting into the detail of the two subjects that you are both most familiar with. But let's jump right in with the biography of Boris Johnson, Sonia, that you wrote. I mean, we are recording this and talking about political biography at a time of the twilight, if you like, of Boris Johnson's premiership.
Maybe.
How hard is it, Sonia, or how hard was it for you to penetrate the persona that we are so familiar with of Boris Johnson?
Well, in a way, which is comparatively easy because people couldn't wait to talk about Boris Johnson. I mean, the number of trains and appointments I missed because they wanted to go on talking about Boris Johnson was really quite extraordinary. I mean, there were so many people. I spoke to over 200 people, I think it was. And they all had some sort of nugget to put into my mosaic, to try and work out what it was in his childhood. And I think there were a lot of things, strands there. Yes, I mean, John is absolutely right to mention what happened with his mother, that she was very unwell, had terrible depression, was away in hospital a lot. They got divorced. His father had many, many different girlfriends and mistresses and goodness knows what. The children, Boris being the oldest, or Al as they called him, of four at that point, I mean, they were left to their own devices at an extraordinarily young age. Boris and Rachel crossing the channel by themselves to go to school from Brussels to Britain when they were age 10 and 11, just extraordinary. And there was this sort of resilience. There's also this kind of this loneliness, not really making that many other human attachments, not really being part of a community, always being slightly different, but driven by this extraordinary competitive urge that Stanley instilled in all of them. I think partly because, Stanley's family, his heritage, Turkish, used to be a very, very important family in Turkey, politically, now not so important. He wanted to recreate this kind of dynasty, and of course, he saw Boris as the person to do that. So it was always about coming first. Second would never do. But coming first, meant that sort of lesser beings fell under your wheels, as it were. And I think all of those things, that kind of strange loneliness of Boris Johnson, the person who can please a crowd but finds it difficult 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, I think all comes from that childhood. And also that lack of feeling of being part of a community, not being a team player. Again, very isolated childhood. So lots of intriguing stuff. And John is quite right to say that these things are important. And all sorts of people wanted to talk to me about this because from a very early age, they thought he is a very, very unusual person.
I wonder also, I mean, among the many things I learned from your biography, Sonia, was the influence of his mother for all of the trauma and the big personality of Stanley Johnson. His mother did inform how he should be. I love that line in your book where she says, it's nice to be important, but it's important to be nice.
Yes. I mean, that's right. I mean, I think Charlotte was the sort of the great civilizing influence, but I think it was very hard for her, and she wasn't perhaps a strong enough character to deal with the sort of blood sport that it is of being a Johnson. So I think those kind of Johnsonian traits in Boris are stronger, unfortunately, you might say, than the ones that he inherited from his mother, although he does have an artistic side, and that did come from her. And I've always loved that line, but I wonder how often he says that to himself now. I'd like to think that he does, but I wonder.
Let's talk about John Rentoul, about knowing the person before you've written the biography. So you have had a long standing interest in the New Labour project. I wonder how important it is to be informed, not just about the politics, but also be an insider, if you like, in inverted commas.
Well, I don't feel that I was an insider. I mean, I was obviously. I used to be active in the Labour Party, and I used to be a supporter of what we like to call the modernisers. But I never knew Tony Blair well until I worked with him when I was at the BBC. I made a film about him, and it was just at the time in 1992 when he when he suddenly got television, and he suddenly became the best communicator on television, which is of course the most important medium still. He just suddenly became the best communicator on television in British politics, and in many ways he hasn't been matched since. But I wasn't particularly close to him, and I do remember the feeling of embarrassment when I'd written the first biography of him, and I'd met him to discuss it and to go through it with him, and he presented me with this copy which he'd annotated in the margins with all sorts of comments, one of which was crap, I remember. And I just suddenly felt that I'd been incredibly arrogant to write about somebody else's life and to intrude into all their personal spaces, and without actually knowing him. And yet he tolerated it, so I give him some marks for that.
Sonia, you also worked alongside Boris Johnson as a journalist in Brussels. I mean, to what extent did that pique your interest at that time, thinking, well, this is an extraordinary individual, and one day I probably will write a biography about him?
Well, I did. You're absolutely right. I mean, I was his deputy in Brussels, and I did think he was an extraordinary individual. But I never thought I'd end up writing a biography about him. That was very much someone else's idea, and suddenly I found myself doing it. I mean, I suppose the thing was that I saw a side of Boris Johnson that people hadn't seen before. We were working in an office of two. We were working very long hours. At the time, everyone thought he was this sort of cuddly bear, shambolic buffoon. But working alongside him, I realized that he was absolutely not. He was the most sort of focused and ruthless and ambitious person I'd ever met. So I always had this in my head. And then when he started sort of climbing the greasy pole of politics, at dinner parties, people used to say, oh, well, you used to work with Boris Johnson, tell us a story or two. So I did. And they'd be sort of, open mouths at my stories. And then someone said famously, Sonia, write a book about this. But I said, well, yeah, but it shouldn't be about what I know. I will need to speak to lots of other people, which I did, like I say, over 200 of them. And then I sort of realized that in a sense, what I had observed was part of a pattern in his life, which, goes right up to the current day. So, it really was someone else's idea. And I did contact him and said, look, Boris, I'm going to write about you. And he said, okay, well, if you get a deal, let's have lunch. So I phoned him back sometime later and said, right, I've got a publishing deal now, Boris. And the lunch never happened. Despite trying, I wasn't all that surprised. I tried several times and sent him a copy at the end and all the rest of it. And it wasn't until I saw him sometime later, he came up to me and said, good on you, Sonia, which is what he always called me. And then said, I should have bought you that lunch, shouldn't I? And I said, well, don't think it would have affected the outcome that much. But yeah, you did promise me a lunch. But we've still never had the lunch. I'm still waiting.
Really interesting. I mean, John Rentoul, you speak about Tony Blair as, as a brilliant communicator and actually unmatched since the time he first came onto the scene. Having written so much about him, do you think that you've come to admire him more or less?
Oh, I think more. I think I've undergone the opposite trajectory from the rest of the country, because I was really intrigued by him early on, and obviously I supported his general approach in the Labour Party, but I did think he was a bit bland and unspecific, and I thought there wasn't much to him, but he was a brilliant politician. Whereas the longer I worked on him and wrote about him, the more I came to admire him, and the more depth I thought there was to him. And I think in particular, I hope if people take one thing away from the books I've written about him, I hope it's that they realise that this portrayal of him as the sort of shallow show pony, the front person to a serious operation run by Gordon Brown, is completely wrong. It's absolutely the other way around. Tony Blair was a much more serious political thinker, and Gordon Brown was a much more superficial PR person.
Let's stay with you, John, for a moment, because given the kind of political colossus that he was, 3 election victories, 2 with enormous majorities, it is the case that currently he's not perhaps disowned by the majority of the party, but to be a Blairite is a bit of an insult. And I want to really talk about the way in which reputations evolve over time. Do you feel, John, that the true assessment of Tony Blair in terms of how you have viewed him is yet to emerge as a kind of consensus view?
Well, you mean people have yet to come to the right Rentoulian interpretation of history?
Exactly, that's what I mean.
That is absolutely the case. And I had hoped that we would have made more progress in that direction, but I'm afraid I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, it is quite heartening that the Labour Party is now not an anti-Blairite organisation in the way that it was. I mean, what's extraordinary about the party membership is that they admire Tony Blair as much as they admire Jeremy Corbyn, which is a very strange combination in my worldview. But no, I don't. One of the great disappointments of having written Tony Blair's biography is that I don't think history will rehabilitate him. I mean, I think it will to a certain extent. I think there's much more interest in what he got right now, but I think people will always have a very negative view of him.
And Sonia, what do you? I mean, maybe it's too early to talk about Boris Johnson in terms of history. I mean, he is still Prime Minister and won't step down until September the 5th in that role. But I just wonder what you think about the contribution that he has made to the way in which we think about prime ministers. You know, you can argue, as you have, that, you know, he has descended into shame and disgrace despite his considerable gifts. But I just wonder how you think history will judge this man.
I mean, I think it is a little bit early to say, and I'm not totally sure that we're not going to see him again as Prime Minister, by the way. I wouldn't totally rule that out. But history will...
You would, John. You think that's it? He's toast.
You don't. I mean, it used to be the norm that prime ministers would get a second term in the 19th century, but I just don't think politics is like that anymore.
It isn't, but then we've never had a Boris Johnson before.
No, that is true.
He's broken lots of other molds, so I'm still waiting for him to break a few more. You know, I don't think we're out of that yet. So, I mean, history will judge him, but history will say, yep, okay, so he delivered Brexit. And then history will look at, you know, how successful was that economically, socially, internationally, and all the rest of it. I think that will be a very hard read for him unless he writes it. Of course, you know, Churchill said, well, when someone said, how will history treat you, Mr. Churchill? And he said, well, it'll be fine because I'm going to write it. And I think, you know, there may be an element of that with Boris Johnson as well. But, you know, it's interesting how views have changed already. I can tell you, when I wrote that book, first came out in 2011, updated a bit in 2012, it was like tumbleweed out there. I was the only person who said, hello, everyone, I'm not sure about this guy. I have my, you know, severe reservations. Hello. And everyone just kind of said, yeah, bye, Sonia. Yeah, fine. Off you go. And then now all sorts of people who sort of, you know, kind of thought I was completely crazy at the time say, well, yeah, we should have listened to you. So, I mean, that's quite nice. But I think, though, that ultimately, I think the office of Prime Minister is going to be difficult to rebuild. I think the way that our politics is set up is going to have to change. I think that, you know, we don't have a written constitution. You can argue whether or not that's the right way to proceed. But what we don't have, though, are sufficient checks and balances on a prime minister that does not obey the rules. I mean, nothing really has contained Boris Johnson. And if we don't want to have that again, then we need to look at how we might contain what some
Sonia, he's not prime minister anymore. He's not prime minister anymore. The system, the checks and balances have worked, and they've crushed him.
Yes, but it took a very long time, and we don't know that we're not about to go through a sort of repeat process. And it took a long time, and it wasn't, in the end, I mean, you know, it wasn't the checks and balances. It was a kind of a bunch of MPs starting to get worried about losing their seat. Well, I mean, you might say, well, that is a check and balance.
The ultimate check and balance.
You know, but, you know, did the Supreme Court work in the way it should have done? Did the civil service work in the way that it should have done? Did all the various kind of police and, you know, law enforcement agencies, did they work in the way that they should have done? You know, I think there are big questions about that. And I think that we need to answer them. And we also need to answer, you know, does the United Kingdom work in the way that it's set up anymore? Is it right that England basically, you know, came up with Brexit against the will of Scotland, against the will of Northern Ireland? Is there something that, if we're going to keep a union going, that we need to kind of fix there and come up with some kind of new system? I think, you know, more than at any other time in my lifetime, all of these questions are up there to be answered. It doesn't look like they're going to be answered anytime soon, but I don't think that means that they're going to go away.
Well, let me ask both of you. I mean, Sonia, you brought up the issue of the office of Prime Minister. I mean, given how degraded it has been by Boris Johnson, the idea that of truth and integrity not playing a part really at all. I just wonder about the kinds of questions. Let's go to you, John, that you would want to see answered, given the degradation of the office under Boris Johnson.
Well, I mean, it's not. I mean, I'm a supporter of Tony Blair, so it's not for me to defend Boris Johnson. But I think you're being a bit harsh, and I think Sonia's being a bit harsh. I think the point about Boris Johnson is that yes, he pushed at the boundaries, but in the end, the Supreme Court ruled against him, and that was the end of that. And in the end, he pushed the boundaries so far that he ended up being a failure as a prime minister. I mean, 3 years as a prime minister, especially for one who seemed so brilliant briefly as to win
and had won the majority that he did. It was extraordinary.
Win that majority and then throw it away in such a short space of time suggests that he really didn't make the office of prime minister work very well. Whereas someone like Tony Blair was there for 10 years and could have been there for, in my view, could and should have been there for longer. But I don't think that's a fundamental failing of the office of Prime Minister or of the British Constitution. I think it's a political failure of Boris Johnson, who turned out not to, as Sonia said, she spotted that he had deep flaws, and that was the huge value of her biography.
Let's talk about something that you dropped into the conversation, I think, in your first answer, Sonia, when you talked about, the relationship between politics and entertainment. I mean, given how much we now have to acknowledge that politics becomes more entwined with celebrity than ever, how does that affect the task of a biographer? I mean, I'm thinking of Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury, one of the biggest selling books about the Trump presidency. Really contained virtually nothing in the way of policy or trying to understand what had gone on, but lots of just incredible gossip.
Yes, I mean, I think that is the way that politics is going. And I remember, when I was researching the book, talking to, I think it was Brian Paddock, who was then the Lib Dem mayoral candidate in London. I think it was him who said, look, when I go and knock on doors and, I don't necessarily get a great reaction, but what people say is, oh, I'm going to vote for Boris. And he said, well, why is that? He makes me laugh. So people were voting for him because he made them laugh, and it struck me. This is sort of the X factoring of politics, isn't it? It's not that because he's going to make the economy better, or my kids are going to get a better school, or I'm going to be able to go on holiday more cheaply. It was that he's going to make me laugh, and I think with Trump, with Johnson, very much kind of in a sort of a category of their own. That the entertainment was huge, and that was why it was so difficult for someone else to say, well, this policy isn't very good because we're going to end up with, soaring inflation or labour shortage, whatever. Everyone said, oh, go away, you're boring. Boris is making me laugh, and it's a very dangerous thing because, of course, politics should have a little bit of showbiz, don't bore people deliberately. But on the other hand, all our lives depend on it. And, actually we could do with someone being quite seriously boring or boringly serious, or both, because this is where the state of the nation today is what happens if you treat politics as entertainment. And I actually think, it's taken us to a quite dark place.
John, what do you think? I mean, Tony Blair was definitely had showbiz about him, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think he was. I mean, he wasn't a. He wouldn't have been on Have I Got News for You? He wasn't very funny in that sense. His jokes were often a bit subtle. He was a show,
or just bad, John.
Well, all bad, yeah. No, but I mean, politics is showbiz and always has been. Actually, I mean, Harold Macmillan was a great showman. I mean, Winston Churchill was a showman. I mean, Boris. The thing about Boris is that he didn't have the substance to back it up. I mean, so yes, he made people laugh and he made people feel good about themselves. He made people feel good about the country. that's what Tony Blair was good at as well. I mean, he just sort of conveyed a sense that the country was going places, that it was young and it was modernising and it was changing in a positive way. But he had policies to back it up, whereas Boris Johnson only had Brexit, really. And once he delivered Brexit, he didn't have anything else. And Brexit, of course, as you point out, was an extremely divisive offering. So I think that was where Boris's entertainment value fell down. I mean, I don't think it's that I mean, maybe politics has become coarser, but I don't think that being an entertainer, making people feel good about themselves, is necessarily a bad thing.
I want to stay with the United States and just get both of you really to reflect on the differences in writing political biographies in the US and here. I mean, how much do both of you read political biographies in the US? I'm thinking about ones that have kind of established extraordinary reputations for themselves, like Robert Caro's multi-volume life of Lyndon Johnson.
It's much longer, and it's got much longer sentences with those huge, long M dashes in them. But it is, I mean, the Caro in particular is magnificent. But I've got a lot of American biographies on my bookshelf behind me, and they do tend to be longer than the British equivalent.
Sonia, what about you? Do you read American political biographies?
A little. I haven't read the Robert Caro one on Lyndon Johnson, but I have read a lot about the Kennedys, the Roosevelts, and Bill Clinton. Mostly, actually, I have to admit, for research for my more recent books, where what they did and how they were as politicians came in very useful. But I'm sort of interested always in what motivates politicians, why they get up early and work those long hours and do all of those things. And there are a lot of very good books about the Kennedys, a lot of very good books about the Roosevelts, including Eleanor Roosevelt, who's fascinating figure. I mean, that's something else that we should mention, actually, because when I was writing about Clementine Churchill, there was very much the sort of traditional view was that she wasn't actually a big figure. She wasn't really that important. She was rather shrewish and all the rest of it. But the more I dug into that story, the more I realized, oh my goodness, you really did get two Churchills for the price of one. She was editing his speeches. She was helping him with cabinet appointments. She sometimes took Attlee's side against him, by the way, if she didn't agree with what Churchill was doing. She was the only one sometimes who had the guts to go and argue with him when she thought he'd got something wrong, such as actually when he backed the exiled king in Greece at the end of the war. And yet, I remember reading these political biographies, where she's basically not mentioned. There's one called The Greatest Britain en Masse, and she's not mentioned once in the index, and that's 800 pages. And it's interesting with FDR that Eleanor Roosevelt, who probably wasn't as influential on him, actually, again, doesn't necessarily get that sort of the prominence that she really deserves, because she did have a big part to play. So I'm also interested in how the women fit in on both sides of the Atlantic, and it's been very intriguing actually to compare Clementine Churchill with Eleanor Roosevelt, similar in some ways and hugely different in others. So I've sort of really looked at things from that point of view.
That is really interesting. I mean, in the context of Caro's multi-volume life of Lyndon Johnson, I mean, I wonder to what extent we could say that Charles Moore's 3 volumes on Margaret Thatcher stand up against something like that. I mean, I've only read the first volume of the Moore, and I'm intrigued by it because, of course, it was an authorised biography. I mean, she approved of Charles Moore writing this book. John?
Yeah, no, and I mean, it really does stand comparison with the Caro, I think, but I mean, mainly because Charles Moore did have access to papers and people that nobody else had spoken to. I mean, the letters. I mean, the letters between Margaret and her sister are a real goldmine for a biographer. But I mean, the thing about Charles Moore is he also writes extremely well, and he's just done such a fantastically thorough job. I mean, it's a joy to read. But it also enlightens us as to Margaret Thatcher's extraordinary character.
Indeed. Sonia, have you read any of the Charles Moore?
I haven't, I'm afraid, and I feel very bad about that, because I would like to very much read that. I'd also like to read a sort of slightly different biography of Margaret Thatcher. Perhaps not the authorised version, but I'd quite like to read a feminist take on Margaret Thatcher, because whether or not you agree with her policies and what she did and how she changed Britain, it was an extraordinary achievement from a sort of feminist point of view. I mean, she really had to battle that, and I don't think she ever called herself a feminist. So I think what always intrigues me, someone like Churchill, someone like Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, I'm sure as well, the Kennedys, there's always a new angle. There's always a new way of looking at these historic great figures that tells us something new. And I don't want to take anything away from Charles Moore's work, because I hear absolutely great things at all points, but I always think there are different ways to look at these characters that might tell us a little bit more.
Sounds like you're carving out your next book, Sonia.
Not sure about that, but anyway, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, let's talk about how hard it is, and this one's really for you, John, because you are such a supporter of New Labour and Tony Blair's project. I mean, how hard is it to try and be as objective as you can, as well as being informed by the fact that you are supportive of this project?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably what distinguishes me from Sonia. She's much more critical about Boris than I am about Tony Blair. I mean, obviously, I'm completely open that I'm a Blairite in my politics. I mean, I've criticised Tony Blair on all sorts of things, and I don't agree with him on everything. But I think that the general assessment of him is wrong, and I think people are far too hostile because of Iraq, which I accept was a mistake, didn't go well, but it was undertaken for the best of reasons, and I think it's important to try and explain that. And I think, as long as I'm honest about my affiliations, if you can call them that, I think I am as objective as you can be in assessing the history of that period.
Sonia, what do you think about those kind of trade-offs and challenges that come with what informs the writer and the writer's perspective?
Yeah, there are trade-offs. And so, I mean, I had certain views of Boris Johnson after having worked with him, but I didn't want it to be about what I thought, obviously. So, which is why I tracked down and talked to so many other people. I thought that was really necessary. And I've always made it clear, look, working with him was not my happiest moment. And I've always said that, but I was perfectly open to being persuaded that, because it didn't matter. I was one person, that was just, if that was a one-off, then that was what it was. And there were lots of other wonderful traits that completely would, counter that. I mean, what surprised me, actually, shocked me, was when I was talking to these 200 people, I wasn't the only one who'd been treated that way, and that there was a definite pattern of behaviour. And I remember having a coffee with Anne McElvoy, the economist, and talking to her about him because they were at university together. And just out of the blue, she said, "Sonia, you're quite disturbed by what you're finding, aren't you?" I said, "Well, how do you know?" And she said, "It's just written all over your face. You look quite shocked." And I said, "Well, yeah, I am quite shocked." But I didn't. That wasn't on my agenda at all. My agenda was, okay, I didn't have a great time, but, very interesting person. Let's find out more about him. And then what I found out did shock me, I have to admit. But I didn't start off that way. It sort of emerged gradually.
When we were talking a little earlier about, what history is going to make of a figure such as Boris Johnson, and you alluded to the fact that, perhaps he will write his own memoir. We've talked a lot about biographies. We haven't really said much about the political memoir, of which there are so many. Sonia, let's stay with you. How reliable are the political memoirs that you've read? And can you just give us some examples?
Well, funny enough, my father appears in one of the Tony Benn memoirs. With my dad was a civil servant at the time, and he's no longer with us, unfortunately. But I remember before he left us, he said that nothing in that entry is true. I didn't say that. Didn't say that. So I've always been slightly suspicious of political memoirs ever since, because of course all politicians want to justify themselves and make everything sound as good as it can possibly be. So I always take them with a little bit of a pinch of salt. Not to say that I don't read them avidly quite often, but I always bear that story in mind when I do.
John Rentoul, what about you? I mean, I'm thinking in particular of the kind of authenticity of Alan Johnson's memoir, which of course won the Orwell Prize not that long ago.
Yes, beautifully written, but the completely different sort of authenticity from Tony Blair's, which is obviously needed a good editor, but is absolutely fascinating, I think, in really sort of exposing his thoughts to the world in a very credible way, which is why I think it's such an interesting book. But I mean, Sonia and I have both had that experience. I mean, because doing interviews for a biography is very much like reading the memoirs, because you get people telling you all sorts of stories, which you then retell to the next interviewee, who says, no, it didn't happen like that at all. It was completely different. And you realise that some witnesses are more reliable than others. I mean, I won't name names, but I mean, you do. That's part of the biographer's job, is to.
Such a shame that you won't name names.
Well,
it's just getting juicy.
Well, Roy Hattersley told me some absolutely wonderful stories about Tony Blair's early career, which turned out to be not quite embellished, shall we say?
Yeah, embellished. Okay, let's end with getting both of you to give us some recommendations of either memoirs or political biographies that you would encourage people to read. Sonia.
Well, okay, so it comes over as light-hearted, but actually I think it tells you a lot. It's very recent, and it's the Sasha Swire diaries. Some people said, oh, they're just light and trite, but actually I think they shed a light on our current ruling class, which is, I don't know whether she realised quite how damning and revealing they are, but I would recommend anyone to read them. I mean, the snobbery, the sort of the incestuousness, the unseriousness of that particular clique that we've had in charge for the last 10 years or so. It's just extraordinary. I mean, it just kind of blew my socks off really when I was reading it. And
so this is Diary of an MP's Wife by Sasha Swire.
Yeah.
John, what about you?
Well, I would always recommend Alistair Campbell's diaries. I mean, they're fantastically long, but they are very thorough. And talking of witnesses that you can trust, I think his diaries, which are always written at night the same day. Well, I mean, not always the same day, but I mean almost always the same day. They are a fantastic contemporaneous record of what actually happened at the heart of government for 10 years. I mean, obviously he wasn't there for 10 years, but for that Blair government. And the other one I would recommend would be William Hague's biography of Pitt the Younger, which I just thought was a fantastic read. I mean, obviously much more difficult to write about someone further back in history, but he manages to bring that Prime Minister back to life in quite an extraordinary way.
And of course, you're both too modest, so I'm going to say it. Everybody should read your books too. Thank you both so much, John Rentoul and Sonia Purnell. That's all we've got time for. I'd like to thank not just Sonia and John, but also the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its continued generous support of this podcast. Now, the long list for the 2022 prize will be announced on the 13th of September, with the shortlist revealed on the 10th of October, live from a special event at the Cheltenham Literature Festival. And the winner is announced on the 17th of November this year. Now, if you'd like to know more about the prize, you can visit the website or follow us on Twitter at BG Prize. Do join me next time for our very special 2022 longlist episode. Bye-bye for now. Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.